Welcome to this first keynote address for Marx 1313, and welcome especially to our keynote speaker, Professor Seyla Benhabib, the foremost authority on Hannah Arendt. We're really privileged to have you with us this evening to discuss Hannah Arendt's reading and critique of Marx. Let me say a few words to set the stage and then introduce you properly, Seyla. The keynote could not be more timely. Just a few weeks ago at Marx 613 on the Communist Manifesto with Nancy Fraser, Cinzia Arruzza, and Tithi Bhattacharya, we read their manifesto, Feminism for the 99%, and we discussed the Marxist feminist critique of Marx's writings, especially in Capital. The critique that Marx explained well the exploitation of workers in factories, but failed to sufficiently focus on the question of social reproduction, on the question of the care in the household, of raising children and tending to the sick and elderly, of sexual reproduction. In some, failed to give sufficient attention to all of the facets of the labor of social reproduction, that is the condition of possibility of wage labor and surplus value. Now, that criticism tracks possibly the distinction that Hannah Arendt drew and made in her formative book, The Human Condition, between labor, which we could think of as social reproduction, and work, which is the production of goods. And of course, as you know, in The Human Condition, Arendt also developed a third way of being, what she called action, and argued that it should have a privilege. Now, many Marxist and socialist feminists have critiqued Arendt in a similar way in which they have critiqued Marx for privileging work, the aspects of productivism, and political action over the labor of social reproduction. So this keynote lecture gives us an opportunity to delve more into that critique, in effect, a critique of both Marx and Arendt, even if Arendt was herself critiquing and rejecting Marx in her own developments. To delve into the critique, it's important to take a step back and place Arendt's critique within the larger context of her writings on totalitarianism and her whole intellectual journey. That is, I believe, the task that Professor Benhabib has set for herself and for us. And of course, no one is better situated to do this and to guide us in this journey than Seyla Benhabib, the author, among many other books, of The Reluctant Modernism of Hannah Arendt, which incidentally I've added to our reading list for this evening, as well as most recently, Exile, Statelessness, and Migration, Playing Chess with History from Hannah Arendt to Isaiah Berlin. Seyla Benhabib is the Eugene Meyer Professor of Political Science and Philosophy, emeritus at Yale University. She's been a senior research scholar here at the Columbia Center for Contemporary Critical Thought for almost a decade now, and is also a professor at Columbia Law School. Professor Benhabib is the author of many landmark books, not just on Arendt, but ranging from her classic works such as Critique, Norm, and Utopia, and Situating the Self, Gender, Community, and Postmodernism in Contemporary Ethics, to other important recent contributions on questions of human rights, on questions of exile, asylum, and cosmopolitanism, such as, for instance, Dignity in Adversity, Human Rights in Troubled Times. And most recently, Seyla Benhabib was awarded the Adorno Prize from the city of Frankfurt am Main, which was a particularly meaningful award, I think. Seyla is a frequent participant in these 1313s. And I just put on the resources a great seminar we had actually a few years ago on the human condition, which can serve again as another piece of background for tonight's seminar. It's a privilege to have you back, Seyla. Welcome, and welcome everyone to this keynote address for Marx 1313. Seyla, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bernard. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I'm in the midst of a wicked cold, as I'm sure you can hear, my voice is unusually nasal this evening, but I very much look forward to the discussion. I'm going to try to situate Hannah Arendt not only in terms of the work-labor distinction and the problem of social reproduction as raised by feminist critics, but I want to begin by trying to outline the biographical features of Arendt's continuous struggle or entanglement with Karl Marx. Arendt didn't just write about Marx, as she has written about Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and many other thinkers. Karl Marx and Marxist teachings, and particularly the workers' movements of Europe at that time, inspired by his teachings, were central to Arendt's reflections on the political. So I want to just share a few images with you, since Hannah Arendt has become now the topic of at least two movies and many more to come. You probably are quite familiar with these images. This document is particularly interesting because she's applying to be able to go back to Europe as the representative of Jewish cultural reconstruction to retrieve some elements of Jewish culture from European countries after the devastation. And she also, in the lower half of this document, indicates that she's living on Morningside Heights and that she's a stateless person. This is a picture of Hannah Arendt and her second husband, Heinrich Blücher. And this is the concentration camp, the internment camp in the south of France at Gours, where Arendt was uh, uh, temporarily interned. Now, Arendt, as many of you know, was born in Hanover in 1906, died in 1975, but she spent her childhood in the same city that Immanuel Kant was born in and lived most of his life, namely the city of Königsberg, or Kaliningrad, as it is called now. Why is this detail significant among many other details that will come up? This is significant because Königsberg was at the margin of the German Empire, abutting Russia and all the East European countries. Arendt very early on saw streams of populations, mainly Jewish, coming from these countries into Königsberg. So the question of migration and the question of statelessness, which turned out to be main themes of her work, were also part of a kind of childhood experience. I'm not going to go into too much detail. I'm sure many of you here know that she leaves from Königsberg, she goes to Berlin. From Berlin, she goes to study with Martin Heidegger, and who is her teacher, and for a short while becomes her lover. But during this period, when she is in Heidelberg, Hannah Arendt meets a Zionist activist called Kurt Blumenfeld. And they become lifelong friends until the friendship is rescinded after she writes Eichmann in Jerusalem. Now, upon Kurt Blumenfeld's request, Hannah Arendt starts doing some work in the Prussian State Library about professional organizations like doctors, lawyers, architects, professors that are throwing their Jewish members out because of their religion, ethnicity. She's assembling this material when she is stopped by the Gestapo. She is taken to the Gestapo headquarters in Berlin, And for 2 days, she is interrogated by the Gestapo. And there was recently a very sweet play about this in New York. But the circumstances under which she manages to get away from the Gestapo are somewhat unclear. But nevertheless, that very day that she's released, together with her mother, she leaves Germany over Prague to go to Paris. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Arendt's Paris life for the significance of her understanding of Marx. Arendt is in Paris as a stateless person from 1933 to 1941 when she comes to the United States. In fact, she doesn't become an American citizen until much later, 51 or 53. But Paris of those years is a city of exiles, not only for Jewish German intellectuals, artists, politicians, but also for militants of the various Marxist and Marxism movements, plus people from the Spanish Civil War. This is an environment in which the goings on in the Soviet Union and slowly Stalin's purges against the dissidents of the Communist Party are being very closely followed. And in fact, there is a large group of refugees from the Spanish Civil War who consider basically Stalin a traitor to their cause for siding with Franco's fascists. And many of you may know this picture. I don't know how well it shows, but I'm trying to find it. Is it sharing properly? Maybe not. I was trying to share the picture of Guernica. Well, I'll just leave that aside. But the famous Picasso painting, Guernica, is painted after Stalin it basically abandons the Republican struggle against fascism and at that moment of distress. Now, Hannah Arendt's second husband, Heinrich Blücher, is one of the German militants who have escaped after the death of Rosa Luxemburg. And Rosa Luxemburg, 1871 to 1919, is one of the most significant leaders of the workers' movements and socialist and communist parties at that point. Born in Poland, she resettles in Germany. By the way, she has a degree in political economy, which is extremely rare at that point in time for a woman. And she becomes the head of the German, the Spartacus faction of the German Socialist Party. And this is where Arendt's husband, Heinrich Blücher, is also a member. The Spartacists are an anti-war faction. And of course, recall that World War I breaks out in 1914, and at first the Russian Empire and Germany, etc., are allies. 1917, the Russian Revolution takes place, and Russia abdicates and gets out of the war. But there is intense discussion in all Marxist circles during the time of the First World War whether the working classes should participate in the nationalist war or not. And Rosa Luxemburg, together with Karl Liebknecht, is decisively from the anti-war faction. But in 1919, they decide to carry out a putsch against the Weimar Republic. And this is a big mistake because members of the Weimar Republic then used some of the fascist forces to go against Rosa Luxemburg and Liebknecht, who are tortured and killed. And this is the point at which also Arendt's husband to be, Heinrich Blücher, who was a militant, leaves and comes to Paris. Rosa Luxemburg is a crucial figure in understanding Arendt's both respect for and continuing struggle with Marx. The story is told that Arendt's mother used to take her to Rosa Luxemburg demonstrations when Rosa, the Red Rosa, the Rosa Rosa spoke. But apart from this autobiographical, element, the significance of Luxemburg's understanding of the workers' struggle is in many places in Hannah Arendt's work evident. First, let me say a few words about the Lenin-Luxemburg controversy. I know I may be taking you back into aspects of the history of Marxism that no longer may seem that relevant, but I'm just trying to present to you the fact that when Arendt is struggling with Marx, she's struggling with the political reality and experience of an entire generation. So the Lenin-Luxemburg controversy concerns the role of the party and the avant-garde. Lenin, in his famous work, What is to be Done, I think, which has been mentioned in your seminars, develops the idea of the party as the vanguard that educates the working class for political struggle, the idea being that left to themselves, the workers would simply be after their narrow economistic interests. Rosa Luxemburg is decidedly against this, and she says that the political struggle is a process of education and self-transformation. A crucial insight for Hannah Arendt, who sees politics never just simply in instrumental terms, but always in expressive and transformative terms. The other point at which Luxemburg's influence on Arendt is significant is in the debate about imperialism. And, we may want to talk about this a little bit more at the end of the session, but this is the section in the origins of totalitarianism called imperialism, which is the second section of the book, and in my opinion, one of the most original and interesting. And whereas Lenin argues that imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, and that capitalist countries start searching for markets for goods and in order to sell their products, Arendt sides with Luxemburg, who says that the project of capitalism is always a worldwide project of primitive accumulation. That is to say, imperialism and the spread of capitalist, West European capitalism towards the colonies is fundamental to the process of original accumulation, so that capitalism is never capitalism in one country, if you want. It's a kind of world system. Let me mention something now about briefly the origins of totalitarianism. The book that preceded The Human Condition. Human Condition was written in 1958, Origins of Totalitarianism, 1951. And of course, this is the book, Origins of Totalitarianism, that catapulted Arendt in the world of political and public thinking and made basically an unknown emigre into a kind of authority on world political events. Some of you may know about the divisions of the book into anti-Semitism, imperialism, totalitarianism. In the section on totalitarianism, Arendt discusses both National Socialism and Stalinism as totalitarian forms of government. Now, this classification of Stalinist Russia and the subsequent Russian Revolution met with a lot of criticism because critics justifiably pointed out to that exterminationist racism in the form of anti-Semitism, but not only against Jews, but against handicapped people, against Slavic people, that this kind of exterminationist racism was not central to the Stalinist project as it was to National Socialism. And of course, this is undeniably true. Then why does Arendt insist on using the term totalitarianism for both forms of government? And for many, many years, the left in many countries of the world was allergic to Arendt's concept of the political and her reading of Marx, precisely because they could not accept this concept of totalitarianism except as a kind of hangover of the Cold War. But Arendt here made a point which is important for the analysis of all forms of authoritarianisms, and which may have some significance for our times as well. I will let you draw the consequences. She points out that totalitarian regimes are political regimes that function like an iron band, and they want to squeeze society and individuals in society so tightly that the spaces, the civic and public spaces among them disappear. She says a tyrant can be thought of as winds in the desert. The will in of the tyrant is like the desert wind. You never know when it will come. But totalitarianism has a specific purpose, which is to eliminate plurality and to create the political as if it was a single unity. And this is achieved by a series of reductionist equations. The state becomes equivalent to the party, being the Nazi or the Communist Party. The party is said to be the vanguard of the movement, and the movement is said to express the will of the people. Okay? So the will of the people is always represented in this hierarchical way by one institution. Now, this is an element in all autocratic government to claim that one acts in the name of the people. This is an important insight, and it shows that Arendt's analysis of totalitarianism was not a kind of just a rehashing of McCarthyism. In fact, she has nothing but contempt for those who denounce their comrades and those who think that they can easily criticize Marx. Given this historical background, given this background of both engagement with and disillusionment of that generation, let us now turn to Arendt's more philosophical critique of Marx. But I hope to be able to have established for you that for Arendt, Marx and the movements inspired by his teaching and all the discussions within the European socialist and communist movements of the interwar period are a reality, a political reality with which he was contesting and not just intellectual exercises. So in The Human Condition, Arendt turns to Marx and says two things. First, she says, there is a contradiction running through Karl Marx's writings. And she says, these kinds of contradictions are not found in the thought of second-rate thinkers. And it's not just an inconsistency. But what is this inconsistency which she finds that goes to the heart of Marx's work? It is Marx's concept of labor, more precisely speaking. It is Marx's claim, present throughout his writing, that human beings transform themselves by transforming nature, and in the process of transforming nature, also create a second world, an objective world of society, of social relations. And Arendt pointedly writes that for Marx, labor is the autogenesis. It's almost like the emergence of mankind into historicity. It is what differentiates the human being, but exactly what differentiates the human being from the bee, as uh, Marx says in Capital, is that the human being has a conception of what he would like to build rather than just like as animals, and some very clever animals like beavers engaging in a metabolism with nature. But Marx also does say that labor is a kind of metabolism that humans must partake in. For Arendt, what Marx calls labor has the characteristics of what she would like to call work. And so let us be careful here because it can get very confusing. And she says, look, in almost all languages, and of course she's talking about the European languages, but this may very well be true of non-European languages as well, there are two words for laboring and for making. What is the distinction? The distinction is that laboring activity is recurrent, it is necessary, it is imposed upon us through our natality and mortality. It is part of the cycle of life. We have to care for our bodies. We have to nourish ourselves. We have to care for the bodies of others. We have to maintain the world around us to be able to go on to survive. But what is work then? Work, by contrast, is world creating and world maintaining, not just world sustaining, but world creating. The Greek word here is poiesis, from which originates our word poetry, of course. From the walls of the city to instruments of music and war, a world of things, gadgets, monuments, and documents are created by work. Work refers to the thing-like character of human life. And Arendt points out that if it were not for the durability of the world, if it were not for the fact that these objects survived beyond a single individual's life, we would be really like in a dream. We would completely lose our orientation. We would not know where we existed. For this distinction, she uses the terms the animal laborans and the homo faber, the laboring animal and the fabricating individual. If one digs deeper, and is not the topic of tonight's lecture, in these opening 60 to 80 pages of the human condition, Arendt is engaged in a dialogue with Martin Heidegger and with his understanding of forms of being in the world, to which she's adding these forms of activity. But let us come back to the human condition itself. I have described what Arendt is doing in these initial pages and in attempting to critique Marx as a form of social ontology. For her, human beings live in plurality. To understand the human being is to understand them as plural beings, but at the same time, this plurality is characterized by certain kinds of activities. The work-labor distinction, which we will return to, is accompanied by a third category, and this is the category of action. Here, Arendt is not only in conversation with Heidegger, but she's also reappropriating Aristotle and Aristotle's concept of pratein, of praxis, of the doing and fine deeds. And for her, action is basically speech and action. That human beings, through speech and action, through legein and pratein, create a world of stories, a web of stories, which is the myriad interconnected doings and tellings. Human beings, she points out, can exist without labor and without work for a short period of time, but they cannot exist without acting. They cannot exist without acting because we cannot be without speaking and doing, and it's only death that puts an end to such speaking and doing. So for her, speaking and doing is another form of natality. Not only are we born of others like us, but we insert ourselves into the world through the of speech and action. And for her, every human child is the author of a script that can never be predicted, that there is always a quality of action that is and remains spontaneous and unpredictable. Now, whether this is part of a kind of romantic faith in the human capacity to generate speech and action, to generate the new, we may want to discuss. These formidable opening pages of the human condition are not only making these categorical distinctions between work, labor, and action, they're also telling at the same time a story of the rise of modernity and the transformation of these categories. I have taught this book many, many, many times, and it is difficult because there are so many narratives embedded in each other that Arendt is trying to tell. One very common way, but misleading way, of reading Arendt's story in the human condition is as a story of decline, what is called eine Verfallsgeschichte in German. Because it seems as if, on the surface, what Arendt is saying is, look, the life of the Greek polis was a life dedicated to pratein, to the doing of just and noble deeds. And as Aristotle points out, only, human beings must live in the polis because only gods and beasts can have no need of others, but we as humans exist in the polis. But then what happens? In the Middle Ages and further along, the political becomes transformed into the social. One of the most confused and waxing categories of Hannah Arendt's thinking, where she says the Greek concept of the zoon politikon becomes animale socialis, And then as we proceed with other turns in modernity, there is a continuous transvaluation of values, the social, and what exactly does she mean by this? Sometimes when you read it, it sounds as if by the social, she's really talking about the market of commodity exchange. That why isn't she saying the market? But there's something interesting in her concept of the social, which ties a bit with Foucault's theory of disciplinarity and disciplinary power, where human beings are homogenized in institutions and seem to act in prescribed, routinized, routinized ways. Now, what does any of this have to do with her critique of Marx? Well, Marx, far from being a critic of modernity, emerges basically as expressing and celebrating the transformation of the human being into an animal laborans. So this capacity of labor power, and you can see here that Arendt knows her Marx, that she knows the distinction between labor and labor power. And she writes when she says, this capacity of human labor power to generate the surplus, to generate more than itself, this tremendous productivity of labor, fecundity of labor, she uses the word. This, she says, eventually becomes the hallmark of the modern world. That, in effect, what antiquity and the previous periods considered labor a life of drudgery, a life of necessity, now is raised to be a life of tremendous unleashing of human power and potential. So this is the point at which then Arendt begins her struggle with Marx in a say. She continues it. She says, but what kind of politics is this? Right? That on the one hand, Marx praises the tremendous productivity and capacity of human labor to create a world. And yet at the same time, Marx sees the emancipated society of the future as a society freed from the realm of necessity, a society in which, to repeat the famous phrase from the German ideology, we can we can fish in the morning, hunt in the afternoon, and be critical critics at night. For Arendt, the Marxian concept of an emancipated society is dangerously apolitical. This will be counterintuitive to many of you, and I'm not sure that we need to accept it, but let us try to understand what Arendt is saying. She is saying that at the deepest levels of Marx's philosophy, there is a sidelining and an ignoring of the dignity of the political. Is this because of the reduction of political struggles to class struggle, that all struggles in human history are the history of class struggles? Is that what she means? Or is Arendt focusing on the fact that the Marxian concept of an emancipated society, the transition from the realm of freedom, from the realm of necessity to the realm of freedom, or the dictatorship of the proletariat, are basically concepts that negate or that sublate the political. I want to say something about the reading that you have been doing in the series, because it's an unusual reading. You've been focusing on Marx's most excellent political interventions, from his early essays on the woodcutters to the question of the 18th Lumiere, to his writings on 1871, the class struggles in France, etc. And you see there, of course, a conception, a very robust conception of the political. So what Arendt is saying, and if there is any justification for it, she's really basically here struggling with the kind of orthodoxy that Marxism represented in terms of the so-called the two theories of dialectical materialism, historical materialism. It is not the most just reading of Marx, and I see that there is going to be also a lecture on the Grundrisse in the series, which is an incredibly rich text that shows the social theory within which Marx embeds his conception of labor and class relations. But let us not dispense with Arendt so quickly. As a number of interpreters of Arendt, like my teacher, Richard Bernstein, also said, we have to learn to think with Arendt against Arendt. Because Arendt's political critique of movements inspired by Marx is not a trivial critique. And an entire generation, I would say, of critical Marxist thinkers, both the critical theory of the Frankfurt School, but also thinkers like Claude Lefort, Cornelius Castoriadis, and others in the French tradition, have turned to Arendt's political critique of Marx, in order to understand or to formulate a more emancipatory conception of the political. Right? And in fact, Arendt herself gives us the cues. I'm going to read here now from The Human Condition, the section on the legacy of the labor movement, page 215 in my edition. Quote, Arendt writes, from the revolutions of 1848 to the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, the European working class, by virtue of being the only organized and hence the leading section of the people, has written one of the most glorious and probably the most promising chapter of recent history. Okay? These are not the words of an anti-Marxist. However, although the line between political and economic demands, between political organizations and trade unions was blurred enough, the two should not be confused. The trade unions, defending and fighting for the interests of the working class, are responsible for its eventual incorporation into modern society. And yet, she points out, at the same time, whenever the working classes have been and have acted as leading societal struggles as such, they have created, I'm jumping to page 219, first paragraph, she goes on to say, they have created a new public space with new political standards. The spring of those attempts was not labor, but those injustices and hypocrisies which have disappeared with the transformation of class society into a mass society. And she has this phrase that with the substitution of guaranteed annual wage for daily or weekly pay. Forget that. I'm not sure what Arendt is referring to by the substitution of annual wage. This has been discussed, but it's not the case in any country, capitalist of the world. But for me, the important phase is that here, that when the working classes have entered into the historical space as actors, they have created a new public space with new public standards. In the first place, she's referring to the legacy of the commune. For her, whenever the working classes have really become historical actors, from the 1871 French revolutions, the 1956 Hungarian Revolution, and before that, the 1917 Hohenstadt Rebellion, or the Workers' and Soldiers' Councils of 1919 in Germany, in Munich and Berlin, they established the same government form, the Räterepublik, okay? The council system. The council system for Arendt is the kernel of any concept of future emancipation. And she reads the council system as the introduction of a new form of public sphere and a new form of togetherness, a new standard of togetherness. It is a transformative vision of the political. Or let me put it this way. It is a vision of the political as transformative and transfigurative. Arendt's concept of the political is deeply anti-instrumental, deeply anti-strategic, and her concept of power is that power, as opposed to violence and force, emerges when and where people are together. It emerges through what she calls, quote unquote, action in concert, right? Now, can this action in concert take emancipatory as well as regressive forms? Obviously, it can, you know? January 6th was action in concert, as regressive as it was, right? On the other hand, the resistance, hopefully to come, and the resistance in many, many points in history will be also action in concert. So we need more criteria. We need more robust criteria to distinguish between emancipatory and regressive forms of the political, and just saying the transfigurative force of power will not do. Does Arendt have such concepts? Does she have in her? I think they're there in her later work, particularly after her emigration to the United States. And when she turns her back, not her back, but when she turns from the European tragedies to the American political experience in highly controversial works like On Revolution, which compared the French and the American revolutions. It's interesting to think what she would say today. But when she turns her eyes to the American experience, to the civil rights movement, to the students' movement, to the anti-war movement, for her, as we know from her late writings, collected under Crises of the Republic, we know that for her, collectives, that civil disobedience, collective acts of civil disobedience are really forms of collective collective action, which she sees that are deeply, deeply indebted to the American political experience. Okay? So in that sense, for Arendt, emancipatory politics is always a politics that has expressive and transfigurative dimensions, and it's a form of politics that tries to create a world, a new world. And she points out that, revolutions always claim to be in the name of a novo ordo secularum, a new secular age. There is one more respect in which Arendt's work became so compelling in the last 30 or 40 years, I think. I mean, she herself would have been really surprised by the kind of global resonance of her work all over the globe. I think the global resonance is due to her having captured this transfigurative and deeply anti-authoritarian sense of the political, right? To the point that you might say Arendt is an anti-institutionalist, and one might get frustrated by saying, how can the creation of a new world be at the same time a world without institutions? Is it only that moment of what the French call the levée? Is it only that moment of the uprising, that resistance that forms the essence of the political? And not to forget that Arendt also wrote with respect to her own struggles of statelessness, being a refugee, having been put in an internment camp, with her own struggles as a Jewish intellectual in Europe of the two wars. She said, you can only defend yourself, or you must defend yourself in the identity, under the identity in which you're attacked. Okay? So if you are attacked as a woman, if you are attacked as a Jew, if you are attacked as a transgender person, whatever identity you think that at that point, or Ukrainian, whatever identity you think that you're being attacked under, that at that point you have no choice but to resist and to struggle. So I'm just going to conclude with this note that I think the secret right now of Arendt's global popularity and is that she not only represents a kind of anti-authoritarian politics, but she is also the thinker of movement politics. Or for her, politics are really at their best the politics of movements and resistance. She has great respect for constitutionalism. It's one of her deep attachments and evaluation of this country, but she was not a constitutionalist in her thinking about the political. She was basically, I would say, at the end of the day, a thinker of the best in the politics of movements. So let me stop here. I'm sure there's a lot to say. I covered a lot of ground. I'm aware of that, and I look forward to your questions and the discussion.
Thank you, Seyla. Yes, that was marvelous. And indeed, you covered a lot of ground. It was a tour of both the biographical and the intellectual brought together. And so that was really extraordinarily helpful. I get a sense that it's almost as if on your reading, which I'm very sympathetic to, it's almost as if we could put aside or somehow Arendt could have skipped the 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 work of distinction and focusing so much on the distinction between work and labor that somehow the real contrast, at least in the way you present it, which I think is right. I mean, the strongest contrast is the contrast between work forms, labor forms. I mean, and in a way, kind of both labor and work for Arendt, and on the other hand, political action or action and the role of politics. So, so it almost feels as if, on this reading, it's a distraction to get too caught up on the distinction between labor and work. That's not where the real force of the critique is. Um, and and I found it striking, and I mean, it's always good when you have a particular passage or a simplification or a model, right? I mean, it's striking when you referred to, of course, that passage in Marx about fishing in the morning, hunting in the afternoon, and critiquing after dinner, right? It is striking that what's missing in there is political action and forms of political engagement, praxis, really, right? Because I mean, there is critique, but it's the critique is after dinner. Um, and I think that, and so I think that I see well the argument that you're making that what is lacking there is somehow a vision of political contestation, democratic forms of contestation, etc. And so I appreciate that. I'm not sure what to make then of the, say, Marxist feminist critique of the undervaluing of social reproduction. Um, and I take it that part of that critique, well, I mean, it could be that we could just say, all right, yes, Marx didn't pay enough attention to that, and that those forms of exploitation fall within the register of the exploitations of labor and work. Um, and but and so we can correct for that from a Marxist feminist perspective and yet still retain Arendt's critique of a lack of a political, which of course is not just Arendt's critique. I mean, there are many philosophers and thinkers who have criticized or been critical of Marx's writings along that dimension, particularly the economic writings, or particularly the scientific later Marx, which, as you noted well, I mean, we've been spending most of our time. I mean, we're getting to the Grundrisse in 2 weeks, but we've been spending a lot of time with the early materials that are themselves more politically engaged. But of course, we're familiar with that critique, and there are times in which it seems right. The critique that there isn't enough political, or there isn't enough critique of the formation of the state, or criticisms like that. So I suppose the question I have is, and then maybe we can open it up so people can put up their hands or um, send me a or put something in the chat, and I'll give you the next word. But maybe the place we can start with then is, I take it that the feminist critique wouldn't be entirely satisfied subsuming the critique within, or subsuming the critique within or with the move that I made, which was in a sense to say, okay, there wasn't enough on social reproduction and the household, and 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 some antiquated notions of gender and and the fact, for instance, that when they speak about um, universal suffrage, it's always universal male suffrage. I mean, so the problems and the blind-sidedness. I'm not. Can it be subsumed with that? I'm not sure that would be satisfactory from the Marxist feminist critique ultimately. That there would be still some resistance, and I'm not sure what you think about that and how to address it, really. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure, sure, sure. I hear your question,
Yeah.
and you posted it. Um, I have written a lot about feminist criticisms of Hannah Arendt.
Hmm.
It's just
Hmm.
that I have not called my critique a Marxist feminist critique because it wasn't. It was coming from a different place.
Hmm.
But one of the important works, at least of my generation, dealing with this aspect of Arendt's work was the volume edited by Bonnie Honig, among others, called Feminist Interpretations of Hannah Arendt.
Hmm.
And we struggled a great deal with many of these issues and unbelievably gendered aspect of some of these distinctions that need to be read and that need to be teased out. Okay? Uh, but as opposed to the Marxist feminist criticism, and here you can see that I have my disagreements with my friends down at the New School, the kind of reading of Hannah Arendt that I belong to is, I don't know if I'm the only one or if there is, how is it that one of the greatest women political philosophers of the 20th century is both thinking and not thinking gender? That's the question that interests me. When you look at Arendt's analysis of action, for example, so much of it seems to be almost a kind of what maybe Kristeva and others may call lecture féminine. It is about webs of narratives. It is about friendship. It is about love, right? So read read Arendt from the standpoint of the presence and absence of gender as a category in her work. Yes, Mark Arendt distinction between work and labor, but not only that. Her distinction between the social and the political and the private and the public are problematic. I have written both about the presence and absence of the women's voice in Arendt's work, but I've also criticized her. I've, taken apart her categories of the private and the political. And so you may say then, well, okay, so then what remains? What remains is learning to think, as Arendt would say. Okay? Arendtian philosophy is not a doctrine. It is a way of thinking, which is always what best philosophy is. It's the art of making and rejecting distinctions.
Hmm.
Can Arendt's work be fruitful or helpful for addressing some of the issues of social reproduction raised by Marxist feminism? For example, one issue that we may want to think about is it used to be that, let's say, in the 1980s or so, the solution to the occlusion of social reproduction from the political was said to be wages for household work.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
Okay. Is this a movement that an Arendtian perspective would support? No, because she would say it would introduce the same kind of instrumentalization of the political, of the trade union movement into the household. Now, is that a romantic answer? Yeah, you may say that that's not enough. It's not wages for household, for housework. What we want is real social childcare, a more just non-gender specific division of labor in the family. We want more communal support for taking care of the aged, uh, not just the young. So I think that an Arendtian perspective may give you a more transformative sense of the political when thinking about these kinds of these kinds of issues.
Mhm,
For
mhm.
me, that is the lasting value of Arendt's way of thinking about politics, and I think many of her distinctions need to be redrawn and need to be rejected or subverted.
Right. Or reinterrogated and
Yes,
used perhaps in different ways, um, or the value is in kind of finding those cleavages and then trying to figure out how to think about them today in the current context and in the context of the forms of whether or not totalitarianism, of authoritarianism, et cetera, that are coming back to play in the present. Along that dimension, not to be too presentist, but nevertheless, I mean, you did speak about January 6th in terms of action in concert and needing to add perhaps more substantive strains to the idea of emancipatory versus regressive forms of political power. Um, what, how would you actualize in a way the origins of totalitarianism today? Um, and think about the most important contributions for us today to understand the situation that we are facing.
there are so many gems in that book. It's really quite astonishing, when you go back. First of all, I talked more in institutional terms in her understanding of totalitarianism as an iron band.
Mhm,
And the power of that metaphor is can be understood in terms of the search for total control. Okay?
mhm, mhm,
Uh, you try to transform the state. You try to make the state in your own image. And that's what's happening.
mhm,
You get rid of an independent civil service.
mhm,
You get rid of professional inspectors, people whose task and whose allegiance is to their work to the state apparatus, not to you, not to the executive politically. Okay? This is number one, taking over of the state. I mean,
mhm,
the Nazis had the word Gleichschaltung, which is like when you try to put everybody on the same speed, right?
mhm,
So the attempt to take over institutions in the name of a unified perspective, the firing of scientists. I was reading today about the cuts in the Centers for Disease Control,
mhm, mhm,
the cuts that are coming to scientific projects in the universities.
mhm,
And believe you me, and we're going to experience the reach of totalitarianism in the universities also. The attempt to crush the media slowly by beginning to generate more and more lawsuits, by taking away or affecting advertisement.
mhm, mhm,
Um, American society is not used to anything like this. Luckily, this country has never experienced anything like this, and that's why it just, one is not even recognizing what is happening. But what is happening has a historical playbook. And Arendt knew this playbook very well. Another point that Arendt makes in the origins of totalitarianism, she calls it the coming together of the mob and the elite. I know we don't like concepts like mob, it's not very democratic. But what she's referring to here is the way in which fascists, particularly the Nazi movement, cultivated a certain coming together of criminality with the elites in business and government positions. Okay, so we have to watch that very carefully in terms of what's happening. So
Right.
these are just
Yeah, Marx had that in the 18th Brumaire through his analogizing of Louis Napoleon and the lumpen proletariat. Now, of course, his his view of the lumpen proletariat is problematic from my perspective, but I mean, it was clear that he was trying to portray the Bonapartists in exactly the same vein and exactly the same way as he was portraying the lumpen proletariat. And it's that exactly what you were talking about kind of the strand of criminality that was running through the elite there, the Bonapartists. Yeah,
right,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
right.
yeah. Um, okay, well, if others want to jump in, just raise your hand or signal to me in the chat, please. Um, we have a question from Hassan, who is in a loud space. So let me read his question. It's always difficult to read someone else's question because it's always a question of putting the right emphasis on the right word, but let me do my best. Hassan asks, is Arendt's conceptual schema situating the conditions of possibility for Marxist scientific discourse to the material genesis of contemporary societies normalizing tendencies which are taking hold of the administration of the health of populations, so what she terms housekeeping, um, where the exercise of state power requires the emergence of a population as a manageable and administrable phenomenon. Um, so is her conceptual schema situating the conditions of possibility for Marxist scientific discourse um, uh, where the exercise of state power requires the emergence of a population as a manageable and administrable phenomenon. In other words, is the condition of possibility to reach the threshold of scientificity the consolidation and victory of the normalizing tendencies of contemporary society, um, the consolidation of the social norms, hegemony for society to function smoothly. Complicated question, trying to link questions of, uh, I don't know, bringing in Foucauldian themes about the manageability and administrability of a population. Do you want to take that on? Does that make enough sense? Yeah.
Well, that's what, I'm glad that you mentioned Foucault because that's what I thought as well. I mean, there are definitely elements in Arendt's analysis or theory of the rise of modernity when she talks about this social taking everything over. At one level, you want to say, what is that? It's like an oxymoron. Everything is social. But she means something very specific. What she means is precisely either the economic or the administration of things, that modern mass societies reduces sociality either to the homo economicus, economic man, or also supplementing it, of course, to the administration of the economic and the satisfaction of needs that arise from it. And indeed, I think a Foucauldian perspective of institutional power in terms of disciplinarity might help here Arendt's analysis, because her concept of the social is not sufficiently worked out, although you sort of have you know what she is anticipating there.
Mhm.
It's a long and difficult question, but let me stay here, and maybe we will come back in the conversation.
Good, good. So I have Robin Mudry. I'm going to add a spotlight to you. Hi, Robin. Do you want to introduce yourself? And you have some questions about gender and philosophy, as well as Rosa Luxemburg and authoritarianism, I think.
Hello, can you hear me well?
Yes, very well, thanks. Where are you
Okay.
calling
I'm
in from?
I'm calling in from the middle of the night in Central Europe, Prague.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, welcome.
Good to be with you again. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have two questions. I was very intrigued by this idea of showing up under an identity that you're attacked with or under. And I was immediately thinking of this famous introduction in the interview that Hannah Arendt gave to Günter Gauss, where he asks her about the women amongst the philosophers. And she immediately says, I'm not a philosopher, I'm a political theorist or a political thinker. And I was, I mean, this just struck me here at this moment because there is, of course, also when we look at Marx, starting from the thesis and let's say the unraveling of the Hegelian legacy, a certain distancing from the philosophers. So I was wondering if you could comment on that, especially when you talked or when you brought up this kind of chameleon handling of the identity and gender identity here. And my second question would be related to Luxembourg because it seems very interesting that there seem or you seem to suggest that there is an interpretation or reception line of Marxism through Luxembourg. And especially when it comes to the revolution of 1918-19, of course, Luxembourg was one of the victims. But I remember that she was very reluctant till the very end, and she considered it a mistake that the revolution kicked off because she exactly did not perceive the working classes in an instrumental way that could be reproached to historical materialism as an authoritarian trait, where the working class is supposed to perform another stage in the dialectics, which she perceived to be deeply unethical. So I was wondering, since you brought it up as an early reference point for Arendt, um, whether that could then be also, I don't want to say an exit point, but maybe a counterpoint to her critique of Marxism from an authoritarianism critique perspective.
Yes, thanks. Good questions. Let me begin with the second. I agree. I mean, the tragedy, of course, is that Rosa Luxemburg did not agree with this attempt to, uh, to push against the Weimar Republic, and she paid She paid with her life for it. And as we know, she was thrown into a canal by the fascists in the middle of the night. But the question of, look, on the one hand, she was fighting against the kind of Edward Bernstein type of revisionism that said, yes, the course of history will integrate the working classes. History is with us. We don't really need, to spontaneously intervene. We will there, we will win. She was against this kind of evolutionism, which she considered a betrayal of the working classes. Undoubtedly, she was in favor of more spontaneous action on the part of, quote unquote, the masses, but she was very skeptical that under those conditions of 1918, 1919, that the German working class was really going to be capable of being already a political subject. And so in that sense, what her party did was the worst kind of vanguardism, and they paid for it. She herself paid for it tremendously. So it was this debate between evolutionism versus vanguardism that Arendt was very familiar with, because Blücher was in the Spartacus faction himself. And okay, so that's one question. You know, in that famous interview with Günter Gauss, you see in a very maybe both touching and objectionable way of Arendt distinguishing between philosophy and political theory and genderizing this distinction. I think that's what you were getting at. She has a rather old-fashioned Germanic conception of philosophy at that point as prima philosophia. Right? And that kind of prima philosophia for her paradigms are very clear, Husserl, Heidegger, the Greeks, right? And she never considered herself to be at that stage. She never considered herself to be at that stage of thinking. And that's why she always said to Karl Jaspers, I have become something between a journalist and a political theorist. Now, undoubtedly, that conception of philosophy itself is very problematic after Wittgenstein, right? I mean, we don't have to accept that conception of philosophy as prima philosophia, but her shyness to use that term for herself, and then of course, though, at the end of her life, what's she writing? She's writing a book called The Life of the Mind, Thinking, Willing, and Judging. So she does go back to philosophy, and it is a fundamental work. Certainly, it's not in the analytical philosophy tradition, but the woman question, this is a permanent irritant in Arendt, and I see no easy way to talk about it except to say it is a generational issue, and it is an issue of the rise of the women's movement. I'm not going to name names, but one of my most important colleagues at Harvard was also an incredibly distinguished political theorist. And I saw the transformations in her and in her beginning to accept that certain life choices that she made and that certain ways in which she approached issues of justice were themselves maybe gender colored. There is a generational divide there. Women like Arendt were exceptional women, and they had deep friendships with other women, but they were not political.
Mhm.
They were not, their politics was somewhere else. Their politics was not, about women's politics. But as I say, it's possible to interrogate, to use Bernard's phrase, the presence and absence of gender in Arendt's work, and I think that's the most fruitful. So tell me, I can see that there are a lot of questions coming, so I should be a little shorter in my answers.
No worries, no worries. That was terrific. And thank you, Robin, for that great question. I think that David Boss's question kind of follows up pretty directly on this. David, do you want to turn on your screen and I can, would you be willing to do that? And then I can spotlight you or, yeah, David, unless you want me to, too slow, unfortunately. Okay, fine. Let me then read your question, David, and address it to Shayla. Thank you very much for your insights, of course, Professor Benhabib. Might reading Arendt through an anti-feminist, as, as an anti-feminist, reveal our own biases towards the differentiation between labor and work? Why must the traditionally female care or social reproduction be seen as labor and not as work? Which I think in part you discuss in your book, The Reluctant Modernism of Hannah Arendt. Arendt's text would allow us to subsume the education of children as an immaterial good. Locke's theory, which is also used in the context of the immaterial intellectual property law, clearly shines through Arendt's lines here. And also as a lasting good. In your words, Professor Harcourt, a good that, quote, is not merely consumed in the process of ourselves, but literally remain for future generations. The German words Arbeit, Werk, lend additional support to such a perspective. The so-called Lebenswerk, the work of one's life, is first and foremost immaterial and directed towards future generations. From this perspective, Arendt would actually reverse the value hierarchy. So,
I am quite in agreement about the difficulty of keeping these distinctions fixed once they are made. Let me try to dig a bit deeper here. In my work on Arendt, I coined the phrase phenomenological essentialism. What I meant by that is that Arendt, coming from the tradition of Heidegger, less Husserl, tries to think what we are doing, the phenomenon of the world, of our activity. But in her analysis of human activity, there is always a kind of topography that she also puts forward. Labor somehow takes place in the private sphere, right? And of course, industrial labor is not quite labor, it's labor and work, it's something else. Work has to have the presence of others, but not as much as action. Oops, what happened?
no, everything's good. Everything's good.
Something moved in my screen and I lost you. Wait.
Okay. Now there you go.
Good. And then action takes place in the public sphere. This kind of phenomenological essentialism does not work. as I argue, all human activities may contain and do contain elements of all. I mean, think about the complexity of household interactions around making a meal, right? I mean, how can you just exclude the very concept of action from the transactions that are going on between friends and lovers and partners, etc., or even power relations? You can't. So in that sense, I completely agree with you that it is very hard to distinguish between world reproducing and world sustaining activities. And you also mentioned the education of children. Now, this is very important for Arendt, and she really wrote about this in her essays on the crisis of the Republic in terms of the concept of culture. She was very concerned about how to transmit the world, how to transmit our values. And she would never really work, to the task of education as simply work. Obviously, education is both labor, work, and action altogether. I mean, those of us, and this is not being maternalist or paternalist or natalist, but we know that raising children is labor, work, and action altogether. So again, think about these categories as illuminating some phenomenon, but as having to be interrogated, as having, and see the multiplicity of the ways in which any complex human activity embodies all three dimensions. I'm not quite sure that I need to say anything about Lebenswerk, but Lebenswerk has that connotation that it's something that remains after you.
Nice. Yeah, you have a beautiful passage in The Reluctant Modernism of Hannah Arendt on this, which I was struck by. Finally, making a meal, the quintessential example of the repetitive, ephemeral labor. This is on page 131 of your book. The quintessential example of the repetitive, ephemeral labor that serves the needs of the body, in Arendt's view, may be an expressive act for a gourmet chef, just as it may be an act of love among two or more individuals. When human activities are considered as complex social relations and contextualized properly, what appears to be one type of activity may turn out to be another, or the same activity may instantiate more than one action type. Yeah, I thought that was very powerful, beautiful example. Let me see. I have two more questions, but there's another. Let me get to Lucas Gardelin's question. I don't know if Lucas, if you want to turn on your video. If not, I can read. I'll start reading, and if you do turn on your video, I'll see you, and you can take over. Dear Professor Benhabib, thank you so much for this illuminating, exciting talk. In your extremely generative work, Critique, Norm, and Utopia, you mention a second and unfortunately unexplored perspective within Marxian critique, which you called sensuous finitude. You write, the experience of sensuous finitude is the awareness of radical insufficiency. It is the awareness that one can be affected as well as affective, and that this is a bond to the world and to others. And this is on page 58 of Critique, Norm, and Utopia. In your opinion, how can we reconnect this Marxian radical strain of thought with Arendt's reflections on plurality and human togetherness? And what can we learn from it about the dilemmas of politics?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Lucas. Uh, that yes, that goes back to a certain reading that I was trying to develop there of, particularly in the context of the 44 manuscripts, I think the way in which one would push further along these lines would be to bring together Arendt's concept of natality with this notion of sensuous finitude. But here we encounter a certain problem. And I think I know where you may be going with this, maybe, okay? Certainly there are readings put forward by Rancière, by Judith Butler, that emphasize the politics of the body. And Butler, in particular, has done a great deal to expand a politics in terms of both fragile bodies, grievable bodies, non-grievable bodies, etc. Now, with Arendt, with the concept of natality, although you can go a certain distance, you're always going to come to the question of language and the political. Okay. I'm not saying it's not possible to try to have a richer concept of sensuous finitude together with the concept of Arendtian natality in action. But it seems to me, for example, one of the distinctions between Arendt and some of Butler's later work, where the emphasis is much more on the kind of embodiment, is going to be the Arendtian emphasis that we are not just equal, but we are also different. Okay? If sensuous finitude as bodies makes us equally vulnerable, equally subject to mortality, vulnerability, what distinguishes us from each other is our capacity for speech and action, where we differentiate ourselves. And this is the point where, you know, sort of this inevitably deliberative dimension, speaking dimension of the Arendtian politics is there. Lucas, I don't know if this is where you wanted to go, but your question evoked these thoughts in me, and I hope will continue when you come in April.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, so I think maybe we have time for 3 last questions and then we'll stop. Janai, the Vita has a question, but I think I'll ask one first, and then Janai, if you want to turn on your video after that, and then ask your question, or I can read it if you tell me you'd prefer that. But let me start with a question though, because I think it works nicely with yours, Janai, and it has to do with the question of ideology. So your discussion of the origins of totalitarianism brought me back, of course, as you were talking and as I was thinking, I went to go pick up my copy of The Origins of Totalitarianism and turned to the additional final chapter that was added on ideology and terror. And of course it's something I'm thinking about in the context of our current predicament. And I'm trying to see how her way of understanding the concept of ideology could be actualized today or understood today. So recall that for her, ideologies, she speaks about ideologies in terms of the isms, right? And she writes, isms which, to the satisfaction of their adherents, can explain everything and every occurrence by deducing it from a single premise. Now, the basic idea of ideology that she presents, I think, in that section, which is added on later, is that an ideology, as she writes, is quite literally what its name indicates. It is the logic of an idea, the logic of an idea. So racism would be the logic of the motion inherent in the idea of race, or deism is the motion inherent in the idea of God. And of course, what she suggests is that in totalitarian regimes, the essence of the ideology becomes a form of terror. And I'm thinking about what's going on today, and clearly we're being faced with a new forms of ideology. I mean, I've always been reluctant to use the word, because I've always thought it was a little bit of a blunt instrument. But right now, it really feels as if there's an ideology that's being kind of laid down on us. An ideology of kind of getting rid of diversity, getting rid of gender ideology, getting rid of uh, ecological awareness, and of course, immigrants. Now, I'm not sure how today that logic that's coming out of the Trump administration is the logic of an idea. I think I see the way in which the ideology is turning into a form of terror, but I see less how it operates as the logic of an idea. It seems more, yeah, it seems more an ideological constellation, really, than the following out or the teasing out of a concept like race or like God, right? Which was the way that I think Hannah Arendt was thinking about it. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that, and on how to actualize or not necessarily her writings in the Origins of Totalitarianism on ideology.
The concept of ideology is interesting because it sort of avoids this distinction between true and false interests, right?
Mm.
Ideology is understood often in left thought as a form of thinking that conceals or displaces or obscures true interests
Mhm.
and makes people believe that something is in their own best interest when it's not.
Right.
I mean, there is that meaning of ideology which became very difficult to sustain in the light of the distinction between true and false interest, the accusations of elitism against the left, etc. There is always something obfuscatory about ideology, but what is it? For Arendt, ideology is such a totalizing view of the world that it is no longer capable of recognizing anything outside itself, that it's no longer capable of recognizing that which is a counterexample to itself.
Mhm.
Right? Ideological worldviews seal the world. Okay, so in that sense, they're blind. That's what she's referring to. The problem, let's say, if the production is failing to meet the 5-year plan, it's not because the Stalinist economic plans are BS, but it's the fault of the kulaks, the middle peasants who are not producing according to the plan, right?
Mhm.
So this kind of totalizing ideological thinking always finds something outside itself, but it always immunizes itself from criticism and from reality.
Mhm.
Arendt says to have an ideology is like having a key. It's a portmanteau, you just open it. You just open everything with the key. So, I mean, or to put it again in Arendtian terms, ideology is a peculiar form of worldlessness,
Mhm. Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And this goes along very well, I think, with the kind of reality of, the social media world.
Mhm. Mhm. Right, right, right. Good. We're not going to keep you too long. I see
Yes, my
you're
voice
a
may
little
be
bit sick. But uh, Janai Levita, who is not only a PhD student defending very soon, but also a professor at Manhattan School of Music
That's true. Yes. Yeah. Next week. Wee.
next
Um,
week.
so thank you so much, Dr. Benhabib, for doing this. So fascinating. And as I've been listening to your lecture and studying Arendt and Marx myself, to which I'm relatively new, I'm thinking about the connections that we find, as I said in the chat, between feminist activists like Silvia Federici, and also a pair of authors who wrote a book and that I'm very interested in, Le Genre du Capital. So the through lines I find are, those that reduce us as human beings to biological commodities. And I
The
feel
two lines
like,
are what?
that reduce us as human beings to biological commodities, basically. I feel like those are the things that all of these thinkers have in common, unless I'm mistaken, but I feel like that's where like the lines intersect. And I think it's very prescient because of what's happening today. So I'm constantly looking for ways to mobilize, or as Arendt says, to make sure that there's a movement in my politics and in politics in general. And so I just wonder if you think between I guess Marx's interest in labor extraction and capital accumulation and also state coercion, if you see sort of what I'm seeing in this authoritarian movement right now, where there's a very strong interest in reducing our plurality in terms of stripping rights from women's and plural gender concepts and statuses. Right now on the CDC website, it's really horrific. I think what you were just speaking about in terms of, what is in someone's best interest and how that's used to manipulate. If I'll put it in the chat, but if you look at the CDC website right now, the propaganda that's posted there, promoting, this rejection of gender ideology is so chilling. And I feel like this is where Federici and Arendt and Marx all align, in this stripping of autonomy, and especially women's autonomy, and binary gender equality, to control our production, to control us, to move us in this Foucauldian biopolitical, or, through power from authoritarian regimes, to manage our populations. And I see it as this pastoral control where people are responding in a way that is promoting this kind of control of our bodies and moving us into directions that reduce our power. And so I wonder, what can we do? Like, what are there things that you have found in Arendt, where she discusses or inspires how we can resist this totalitarian control, by taking away our political power? How can we effectively, like, at a time such as now, how can we take that back? What can we do?
Thank
Wow. I take that in lawyerly language as a friendly amendment
you.
because I agree with so much of what you said. Look, I haven't read Sylvia Federici that closely. I know that she's going back to this question about wages and the household work and so on. But let me not uh, say something concrete there. What I think, a phrase that you use, crypto fascist. pastoral control. I think what we have to ask ourselves is, how can we build now significant coalitions? Again, I believe maybe we have to rethink phrases like toxic masculinity, because we need coalitions. We need to get together around this. And the question of the obliteration of difference, right? Is it just the threat that cisgender males, may feel in the face of all these things that are going on? I think that there has been a little bit of a lack of attentiveness to what the Frankfurt School so brilliantly analyzed, namely the psychosexual origins of authoritarianism, right? I mean, we are confronting this. It's just hitting us in the face. But we have to cut a bit deeper. The Frankfurt School focused on the changing role of the father in the family in their analysis of why so many of the working classes were ready to adopt an authoritarian figure. I don't know. I don't think that this analysis is sufficient for today. I think we are dealing with something much more complex, because the the image of the single male head of household, that is the pater familias, that image has been gone, okay? But to speak maybe psychoanalytically, the fact that that social imago has disappeared does not mean that the fantasy does not live in people's lives, okay? So there's just some more careful thinking that we have to do also as feminists, to try to understand, and not just as feminists, to try to understand why these images are just circulating, and also the process. Why is the process of othering so successful? And I mean, it is astonishing, right? I mean, when you look at the statistics, it's not huge, but about the number of African American and Hispanic men who nonetheless did vote for Trump, right? And you ask yourself why or how. I mean, I think the question of immigrants is more complex. Older immigrants feel that the incoming newer immigrants destabilize their social status, and particularly Hispanic are very afraid of that destabilization. I think that's well established. But what else is happening? I mean, to go back to Bernard's question about ideology, we're living in this world of the circulation of images. I don't believe, okay, this is a double negative, that the majority of the American people are so dumb and thoughtless as not to know, okay, as not to know that, let's say, 50,000 asylum seekers are the cause of their economic misery. I just don't believe that. I think that people very well know this. Okay? Just as we here in New York know that whatever homelessness there is in New York was not caused because of the Venezuelan migrants that Texas shipped over here, right? Homelessness was here much before. It may have gotten exacerbated. But why is there this readiness to other and to externalize? Where is this coming from? To say prejudices is too simple. We have to analyze, to speak with the Frankfurt School, the structures of prejudice, which always are based on things like projection, exteriorization. You project onto the other the fear that you have, the elements that you have, repressing yourself. I mean, I'm using some of the psychoanalytic categories that the Frankfurt School used. But I believe that our times do call for for us to mobilize all the analytical tools of social and political and at our disposal, and from Arendt to Foucault to psychoanalysis to Marcuse, whatever. This is the time to establish a united front, genuinely a united front, because what is at stake is so tremendous that no group can accomplish this. So it's time for grand coalitions. It's time for a truly united front, and I'm hoping that once this awful cold winter is over and spring comes, l'étang de cerise, right? As Bernard knows, the time of the cherries, that maybe the people are going to go onto the street, but we are going to need some kind of organization for massive civil disobedience.
Thank you. And thank you for that question, Chennai. Thanks. Okay, so one small last question, because you gave an incredible little teaser, and for our next Marx 913 session, which is going to be on the Grundrisse. And so you mentioned the Grundrisse in relationship to Arendt's struggle with orthodoxies, but you mentioned that the Grundrisse is such an important text because of the way in which Marx lays out a social theory within which he embeds his economic analysis. And I thought that was fascinating. So maybe a few last words to get us prepared for our session on the Grundrisse. What did you have in mind by that?
Oh, I mean, when you read the Grundrisse, you understand that all these categories about modes of production, forces of production, relations of production, that all, history is the history of class struggle, and that at one point in time, the modes of production develop so much, the forces of production develop so much that they act against relations of production, etc. I just, what Marx shows there brilliantly is the totality of social relations in different formations, pre-capitalist, capitalist, and the brilliant analysis of exchange, that all these more mechanistic distinctions, that you really cannot talk about modes of production without talking about relations of production. What is a mode of production? Is it an instrument? No, it's a social relation. It's an institution. And so the Grundrisse is an incredibly rich work in that sense. I hope that I will certainly attend the lecture, and I look forward to the readings of that session.
Great, wonderful, wonderful. Well, Seyla, thank you so much for an incredible keynote address, and for entertaining all of our questions on such a wide range of topics. This has been really extraordinary, an incredible learning experience for us, and we are deeply grateful. So let me join everyone in thanking you
Thank you.
immensely for this, and you're getting a round of thank yous in the chat too from everyone.
Thank you. It's a
Thank you.
pleasure.
Thank you so much, Seyla.
It's a pleasure. I'll be there at one point on, in person, but I certainly March 6th we have our session.
Yes. Yes, we also have our session on March 6th on your edited book.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Thanks a
Thank
lot.
you. Thank you,
Yeah.
Seyla.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.